SkillStruct presents.
Hey everyone, welcome to the SkillStruct Presents Tech Series, where we've got a special theme today, microservices. And I'm glad to be joined by Sam Newman, very established in this space, a tech consultant and has done many things. So we're definitely going to chop it up about all sorts of things, philosophy-wise and software development-wise. So Sam, welcome to the SkillStruct Presents Tech Series.
Thanks for having me, Michael. Thanks so much for having me along. And yeah, I'm looking forward to exploring, or whatever you want to talk about, really. Microservices and everything else beside.
Awesome. That's what I like to hear, because I definitely will take you up on that. So I guess before we get into microservices and all of that, I believe you've done programming in your past. And what I like to do here is normally do a sort of, what was your first hello world? So just a bit of program credentials for the people, just to let them know a little bit of your background there. So what was your first experience programming?
Okay, so I was one of those really fortunate people that sort of had a computer knocking around at home. Like one of the, it was interesting with Sir Clive Sinclair just dying, but we had a BBC Acorn Electron at home. It dates me a little bit, right? That came out in '83, and I remember my dad bringing it home. I suspect likely that would have been my first Hello World program, which would have been using BBC Basic. If I didn't program then, because I would have only been about 7 or 8 probably at the time, if I didn't write a program then, it would have been, the next one would have been I got a Sinclair Spectrum. I want to say it was a 2A plus, which had a weird glitch with the firmware, which meant that about 2/3 of all existing Spectrum games would not work on it. Very annoying, but I definitely did a Hello World program on that. So that again, but they basically variations on Basic. So yeah, I was kind of like, I had it just knocking around at home very early on. And this is back at a time when you could get a computer magazine, you could buy one from the newsagents, you'd have a listing in the pages, you type out that listing, and you would be able to create a computer game that wasn't that far removed from the quality of computer game that you could buy on a tape. So that feeling that I could create something that was actually worthwhile happened sort of fairly early on. Which is sort of interesting now, seeing my son learn to program, and the idea that I can type something in and it starts looking like The Witcher 3 or something like that. That's not going to happen anymore, So yeah, so I reckon it was about that. I wasn't paid for that, obviously. That was just messing about at home.
Yeah, no, that's great. And what about some of the modern languages, really? What was your first language, really, when it comes to some of the modern, more traditional languages we know today?
Well, the first programming language I think I was paid to write was Fortran 77, that was released in 1977, the year of my birth. Literally a programming language, still influenced by punch cards, and then C and Java, really Java from very early on. Nowadays, I don't program as much as I used to, but when I do program, it tends to be out of necessity. So I do quite a bit of Ruby. That's the thing I do mostly, just purely because my website is written in Ruby. I've got a bunch of scripts, and Python tend to be my go-tos, because I'm mostly doing kind of scripting, or I'm doing sort of infrastructure automation type tasks. And both of those programming languages work pretty well. The language I still know the best is likely still Java, though, just because having used it for about 15 years solidly, off and on, there's some of that stuff is still ingrained in me, and I'm pretty sure I still know about 1/3 of all the IntelliJ keystrokes. So it's still stuck in there. It's like muscle memory kicks in. But yeah, after about probably 15 years, being solidly 15 years plus of being a programmer since I left university, I don't program as much on a daily basis anymore.
Okay, no, that's fair enough. Obviously, there's been an evolution there. So I guess speaking about that, I want to know a little bit about yourself. So if I was to say, who is Sam Newman, what would you say to that? Who is Sam Newman?
Okay, I suppose nowadays I'm known as being like an expert on microservices. So that's sort of what I guess my public brand is. And look, I'll be clear, and we might get into this later, I did have to think a little bit consciously about building a public brand, because that was sort of part of my own personal way I wanted to grow my career. But nowadays what I do is I go and work with companies and help them ship software, right? That's my job. So someone's got an idea, they think writing code is the best way to implement that idea. And a lot of my job is in, okay, how do I help you get that into production? And that's been kind of the thing that I've been most interested in the last sort of 15, 20 years. And so more often than not, people will call me in because they've got a microservices shaped problem. But really, I split my work almost between like sort of 3 different buckets of work, really. I do like sort of training and workshops. So I do a lot of stuff on the O'Reilly platform, and I do like train you up on microservices. I then do consultancy. So how do we help you're thinking about if microservices are right for you? I'll come in and give you some thoughts and some advice, maybe help structure that conversation. And the third bucket of work is really writing books, which I really enjoy. For me, it's all about having an impact. You know, I make enough money to pay the mortgage, so that's good. So that the rest of it is like, can I do things in terms of doing conference presentations, in terms of writing books to help share ideas with people, to try and help, I guess, spread the knowledge in terms of what works, what doesn't work. And hopefully that means if people don't, you know, they can pick up a book and read some of my ideas, and then hopefully that helps. And that's one of the biggest kicks I get is people saying, I read your book and it changed how we did our project. That for me is a real big thrill. Even if they then say, and it was a disaster, I don't care. I've had an impact. So as a, you know, again, as a professional, I kind of have to balance those 3 buckets of work. Just, you know, just the 3 pillars of Sam Newman and Associates, which has 2 employees, and I'm one of those people. So awesome. That's kind of the balanced work.
Cool. And we're definitely going to get onto your brand new book. Just to set the pyramid or the stage of it, we're going to first of all talk about monolithic architecture. We're going to talk about Microservices as well. Obviously, traditionally, most people are probably accustomed to, well, software developers. You have your database, you have your services, you got your UI layer. I guess that's the normal monolithic structure that we're used to. You obviously come with a different point of view per se when it comes to how you should focus, particularly on the services, how you can actually have different types of services. And I guess for scalability and for sustainability, that's probably one of your reasons why you have that and you champion that a lot more. So for people who are new to this space, why don't you explain the differences between monolithic architecture and microservices?
Yeah, I sort of, there are different definitions of a monolithic system out there. The one I tend to rely on is this idea that a monolithic architecture is one where it is basically defining a unit of deployment. So you might have all of your code packaged together in one single process. And even if you want to deploy a single line of code, you have to deploy the whole process. You could also have a services architecture. Maybe you've got 5 or 10 or 15 different services, and you want to change a single line of code, and you still have to deploy all those 15 things together. That's kind of, it's almost like a monolith as a unit of deployment. And in many situations, monoliths make perfect sense because there's certainly the single process monolithic architectures are very simple and straightforward from a deployment point of view, at the very least. And so what I got, but my whole thing was, how do we get software into production as easy as possible? And if I have to deploy the entire system to roll out a single line of code change, well, that kind of makes my deployment processes more complicated and more risky because I'm kind of changing more of the system just to roll out one little change. And I was like, well, how do I de-risk deployments so I can release more frequently? So the idea with microservice architectures is you have a system that consists of all of these microservices that collaborate with one another to create the system as a whole. But that if I need to change a single line of code in one microservice, I can change that microservice and deploy it without having to change any other part of my system. The idea really is about trying to reduce the scope of the system that changes as part of a release. And, you know, anecdotally, just my own experiences, mostly at ThoughtWorks, led me to believe that releasing more frequently was sensible, not just from a point of view of time to market, but also de-risking deployments. And we've now got like a whole good body of evidence to show that organizations which release software more frequently have things like lower defect rates. So actually, if you can release more frequently, you'll probably have lower defect rates, fewer rollbacks, happier customers. So for me, a microservice architecture is one way that you can look at how you increase your release cadence. That was my main reason for getting interested into it. But I see it very much as a means to an end. And for many of my clients, just to be super clear about this, you know, they'll say, should we use microservices? And I'll often say no. a single process monolithic application where all your code is in one big process and it talks to one big database and I've got one big UI layer. For many people, that's perfectly good. And you could build very successful companies off that. When you start breaking these things apart and they become more and more distributed, you amp up all the complexity and the pain points, and sometimes it's not warranted. Most of my life nowadays is not programming, it's having conversations with people about technical trade-offs. Like, microservices let us do all this cool stuff, but they're also going to make our lives miserable. So how far do we get on that? So I think that one thing to say here is you shouldn't think monolith is bad, microservice is good. That's not the way to think about it. Think about it more like you've got a toolbox and you've two different tools or two different choices that you can make. And in many situations, the monolithic architecture makes an awful lot of sense.
You beat me to my next question, actually. I was going to basically debate that with you and basically say, it sounds like with microservices, it just depends on the frequency of how much you deploy something. And so if you're not deploying as often, then does it justify it, or is there something deeper to that?
There can be many. The reason I got into it was because of that frequency of deployment, but there are other reasons why you might pick a microservice architecture. But when I work with just to kind of maybe deconstruct what I do when I sit down with a client, I don't start talking about microservices versus monolith. The first thing I say is, what is it you're trying to do? Like, if you think about all of these technical choices we're making, a means to an end. So if they're looking to make, say, a change in their system architecture, the question I've always got is, well, what is it you're trying to do that your current architecture doesn't allow you to do? So what's the impediment? And it could be because they're not shipping frequently enough. It could be because they want to scale their organization. It could be because they want to handle more load. And then you get down to the nub of what the real problem is, or problems, plural, are. And then I'll say, okay, are there other ways we can solve that problem? Like, if you want to scale your application, for example, have you tried getting a bigger machine? Have you tried running multiple copies of your existing monolithic architecture behind a load balancer? Because if you hadn't, you probably should try those things first. So I always try and get to that outcome. And then for me, it actually simplifies the discussion. A lot of the time when people aren't sure if they should stick with their single process monolithic architecture or go to microservices, often the reason they're not sure is because they don't actually know what change they're trying to bring about. And I think an awful lot of people are just, everybody else is doing microservices, so we should too type. That's their kind of default setting. And I think that's problematic, because then it leads you into almost saying, okay, we're going to do microservices, right? Let's try and justify it. And then let's try and work out how we're going to do it. Whereas I think if you know why you're doing it, a lot of the how questions get answered, if that makes sense, because you kind of know what outcome you're looking for.
Yeah, the power of the why, definitely. I can definitely relate to that. And you're right. When you actually bring up, it's not a versus thing. It's basically just an understanding what your business is doing. Because obviously when we code, the first thing or the important thing is the business domain. And in order to code correctly, we need to have a good understanding of the business domain. If we are coding based on a domain on the false pretenses, it might, as a consequence, we lose that, the how, because we've lost the why really in that. And it's definitely important to ask those questions, as you pointed out, before we get into even, microservices, yes or no. I think, sometimes as software developers, we might get, to shiny new toy syndrome. Oh, what's the new thing? So, okay, we see microservices, that's the buzzword now, so we should do that. Just so maybe we can go to a conference and say, I just code using microservices, and then just to feel how big I am.
There is something in there, though, which is like the shiny object thing. There is something about that. And I really liked, I think it was Dan Pink that kind of came up with the 3 pillars of employee motivation. And I might be getting the exact phrasing of what it is wrong, but basically talked about the ideas of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And as somebody in a job, you want to have a mix of all 3, right? You want to have autonomy, you want to be able to get on with your job and not be micromanaged. You want mastery, you want to be able to grow your skills and learn and evolve yourself and grow your own career. And you want to have purpose. And often that means you understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. And so, a company clearly articulating what they're trying to do and how you fit into that might help give you that purpose. But a lot of the time when I see the shiny object thing happening, it's because the person hasn't been given any other opportunity to grow that mastery. And so when the opportunity comes along for them to say, to push something that allows them to get that mastery, that's what they do. And so they say, okay, I'm going to do microservices because I need to grow my skills and I'm not being given any other opportunities out there. So if so it's like when I see those situations, it's like, well, often the fact that they're pushing for microservices is often a sign that they're not being given other opportunities in that job to grow the skills the way they want. And the company isn't giving them those opportunities. So, I think if the only reason you're moving to microservices is because it's a shiny object, I think you should stop. But I think you should also understand, why do people want a shiny object right now? Because you want your staff to be happy, right? And this is kind of another just, interesting thing is when you do make technological choices, I say it's always about trade-offs, you often do have a multitude of forces to take into account, and picking technology that will make your people happy is absolutely part of that decision-making process. It just probably shouldn't be the only reason you pick it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. It's almost like because we don't maybe have autonomy or mastery per se, we're just focusing on a purpose, and maybe something new makes us feel like we've got a purpose. And I guess you're right in that sense. I guess maybe on the flip side, when it comes to those 3 points, is there a case of just too much autonomy, for example, or too much, maybe not too much purpose per se, but I think autonomy is an easy one to focus on with that.
That's a really, because that is if you look at most enterprise organizations, when you distill down why they're going to microservices, when by enterprise, I mean like really big companies, they're often doing it because they like the idea of being able to operate at scale without all the disadvantages of scale. So they want to have lots of people working in teams without requiring a lot of top-down middle management. And so the idea of having an organization which is built on sort of loosely coupled autonomous teams seems really attractive to them. This is kind of the Amazon scale of that model of scaling. And so they see an architecture like microservices and think, oh, okay, well, microservices are going to let me have these teams that have way more autonomy. And if they have way more autonomy, we need less middle management. We can grow more rapidly without all the costs of scale. But when you actually when the rubber hits the road, when you have to start having the conversation, okay, what autonomy do you want these teams to actually have? Right, the definition of autonomy that I think sharpens the focus the most is saying it's about distributing responsibility. Right, if you're a top-down command and control organization right now, all that responsibility is centralized in maybe the head, in control of 1 or 2 people. If you really want to move towards this within the organization where you've got these autonomous teams, what responsibility are you going to push into those teams? And it's not a fixed number. Like it's not like a 1 or a 0. It's not a binary. It's a degree, and so you can choose how much you give, but you do actively need to engage in the process of. Microservices theoretically let you increase the amount of autonomy you give your teams, but you've actually got to give up the control. And often the interesting thing is the person or the group of people who are making decisions to move forward with microservices also have to be okay giving up power. And without this becoming a much bigger socio-political conversation about centralization of power in our society, in an organizational setting, to get the most out of this, you are actively going to have to say, I'm going to push responsibility to these teams and help them take responsibility as well. So there's no point in saying, okay, well, as of next week, you're all running and operating your own software. It's like watch people quit in droves when they find out what that life actually means. But saying over the next 12 months, we would like you to move to the point where you do your own deployments into production and you do production monitoring. And in exchange for which, this is all cool stuff that's going to happen, but we need to get there together. And I'm going to help you take that on board. You can't just take all these skills and go sort of squeegee that out. It's, the organizational change aspects, and often microservices are selected, whether people realize it or not, they're often used as a way of enabling that organizational change, which is an angle of which I totally did not appreciate when I first got into this stuff. I came into this, I wouldn't say purely technologically based. I was very interested in breaking down barriers between dev and ops. That was the world I was in at ThoughtWorks. 1 foot in the operations camp, 1 foot in the development camp, purely because I was the person that knew how to write some Unix code, right? a little tip: having weird esoteric skills in the project team can sometimes be super useful when they find out you've got that skill. So I was the person that knew Unix and ended up running all the builds for what the second project I thought works. So I was interested in breaking those barriers down. So part of this was about enabling communication, but I underestimated at the time the extent to which microservices are vital, or at least not, or maybe the way they go hand in hand with changing how you think about your organizational design. And so that's something that I'm still kind of, I guess 10 years on, I'm still thinking about and trying to work out what that looks like.
Yeah, no, it's almost like we're getting into a topic of centralization versus decentralization, because that's what ultimately, microservices bring out in an organization in terms of how they see a company, really. But before we go on to that, I wanted to talk about your book, of course.
Yep.
That's just recently come out, or is coming out at the end of the month. I checked on Amazon.
It is out, Michael. Okay. I don't have a copy. I've got friends in India have got copies. I've got friends here in the UK. My copies are not. I don't know where my copies are, but they do exist. Yeah. Apparently, the book is out an ebook, and I'm sure by the time this podcast gets out, we'll be shipping certainly in the UK, US, and India. Paper copies anyway, and I'm making its way out to Europe, but ebooks are already available today.
Talk about why people should buy your book, first of all. Obviously, it's in and around microservices. Tell us why people should buy it, perhaps, or just set up what is the book about.
So I aim the book to be the definitive guide to microservices. So there's almost like two things I've tried to do with. The first is to explain what microservices are and the pitfalls around them, and the advice I would give if you're looking at implementing microservices. That's the first piece, is like, here are the things I think you should be doing or not doing, as the case may be. The second thing I've tried to do with the book is to explain how picking a microservice architecture fundamentally changes some aspects of the software delivery process. So how does it change your source code organizing, your build, your deployments, your how you build user interface? How does it change how you test your applications? How does it change the security aspects of your application? I think often people make a decision to move to microservices without realizing their ripple effect. There's lots of conversations about how does it change your organizational dynamics as well. So partly it's like, here's what microservices are, here's how to do them. And another part of that is, here's how the different aspects of software delivery will change. It is technology agnostic by design. It is not a book which says, here's how you create a microservice in Go or in Python, because there are books that do that. I think my book is trying to say, here's the kind of microservices you want to create. And then, then you'd want to follow up with, okay, well, I might go and learn how to do that with the framework of my choice for Python, for example. So I'm hoping it's got broad general applicability as a result.
Okay, and I should also mention, obviously this is a second edition, of course. You did write a first edition as well. For those who picked up the first one, specifically to those, why should I get the second one? What is in the second one that might not be in the first book?
Well, it's longer. This is one of those things where it was like, I tried to write a shorter book and didn't have time problems. I want this book to be correct and clear. And in the 5 years since, 6 or 7 really, since I started writing the first edition, I explain things in a different way. I'm hoping that I get better and clearer at explaining things. And through experience and working with other people, I can be a bit more explicit about certain ideas. I'm hoping there's an improvement in terms of the clarity of communication. The second thing is we've learned a lot more about microservices. So early on, I was drawing on a certain set of my own experiences and the people I knew. I've now met a lot more people. I've worked with more companies. There are loads more great case studies out there. And so I really wanted to take on board all that sort of institutional, industry-wide knowledge and update it. And there were certain topics which I think just needed to be expanded upon. To call them out specifically, coverage of the user interface was touched on in the first edition, but not in a way that I think was good enough, because I still saw lots of people missing what I assumed people would get out of that. And so I wanted to be more clear around that. Also expand a lot around deployment aspects, because of course that whole world has changed. I've also gone back to looking at ideas around things like information hiding, which is an old idea from the 1970s, believe it or not, and looking at how that really simple concept can have a lot of value in not just how we think about microservice architecture, but even monolithic architecture as well. So chapter 2 really is all about finding the boundary stuff. So it's not just talking about domain-driven design, it's going even much further back than that idea and talking about how you find the boundaries. So improve clarity, I hope, in communication, more breadth in certain topics, and sort of just updating it to bring in new references from industry experience.
Okay, fair enough. And once again, where can people pick this up? You know, maybe list some of the vendors where they can purchase it, things like that.
Sure. A bunch of different ways. If you want print books, it should be out pre-order end of month in the UK. I think US it's already available, and India it's already available, the print book. Ebooks are already available right now, so you can get that on Kindle and things. If you're a member of the ACM, you'll get it as part of your O'Reilly Learning Platform subscription. And likewise, anybody signing up to the learning platform at O'Reilly will get access to the ebook version. Little tip, you can sign up for a free 7-day trial. It's a 671-page book, but if you want to try reading that in 7 days, good luck to you. So those are probably the best way. Little bit of inside baseball knowledge. Not only is it better for the planet, but I actually earn more money if people buy ebooks than print books. So that's just, people sometimes think that's different. No, authors actually tend to make more money from ebooks because the purchase price is not going into printing up dead trees. But yeah, for those of you who can't wait, print books will be out end of the month in the UK at least.
Awesome. Thank you for letting us know that. I won't, try and pry about the book. People should definitely get the book so they can find out themselves. But hopefully this conversation can make you realize why you should get the book, because obviously the book is a deeper version of, even some of the stuff we're touching is all pretty much surface level, but that deep knowledge when it comes to microservices and beyond is definitely in that book. So I definitely encourage you to purchase it. We'll put the description, should I say, details of where you can purchase it as well. So yeah, let's flip back now to when we're talking about centralization and decentralization when it came to microservices and what that ultimately brings out in an organization. What's your thoughts on that? Do you have a particular side on that, or are you pretty much it depends?
Okay, I'm going to say it depends because I'm a consultant. Of course, I'm going to say it depends, Michael. But let's still let you know, really, there isn't one side to pick. I think the important thing is to understand the balance exists. So let's take let's take a simple example. Let's imagine that you've given the teams that own your microservices full responsibility about how those microservices are implemented. Right. So you've got team A, B, and C. And team A have made a decision that they're going to pick MongoDB as their database because they heard that apparently makes them web scale. Team B has picked Oracle because they know Oracle really well and it's familiar to them. That's why they've picked it. And team C has picked Cassandra as a database because actually they're looking to scale write volume quite heavily, and Cassandra's quite well at that. So in that situation, you've given them quite a lot of freedom. And you're looking at individually at team A, team B, and team C, and each of those local decisions makes perfect sense. You can understand why that team came to that conclusion. And in isolation, looking at it from as a local optimization point of view, yeah, that all makes common sense. But then you step back a level and you go, does it make sense for us as an organization to have 3 different types of databases that we need to support, that we might need vendor agreements for, that we need to have, maybe support contracts, we might have to do training for people? Or do we just pick a single lowest common denominator that's good enough for most things? The sort of human equivalent is, you've got 3 kids, do you send them to 3 different schools, or do you hope they all go to the same school? So then you've only got to make one trip to the school, right? So there is this trade-off. Now, in some organizations, they might value the ability to have that flexibility of technology, and for them, the costs are worth it. In another organization, they might go, no, that's not right for us. We need more consistency in that area because we don't believe the increased cost of having these different choices is worth it to us. And you might make different choices at different places. You might say, look, you can pick whatever programming language you want, or you might not. Or you might say, I don't care what you write your programming language in, but you've got to be deployed in the same cloud platform. This balance between what has to be done consistently and what you allow people to vary is dynamic. And I think there's like when I work with sort of architects and CTOs and stuff, all I'm trying to do is not say, I can give them advice, okay, based on your business model, based on your vision, based on the problems you're facing, this is probably the right setting for you on these things, but recognize that as your people change, as your company changes, as what your customers need change, that balance might shift and might go in a different direction. And so I think it's to recognize that you have, I think historically, we viewed computer programming in a very old-fashioned manufacturing ethos way. You'd tell people, stamp that widget faster, right? You tell them what to do, micromanage them, and tell everyone what you do. And so they had no control. And all decisions were made centrally. That's not the world we operate in anymore. So I think recognizing that this opportunity to distribute and to empower people is there. And you might also change your mind. To give you a real example of a company that changed their mind on this, and this is quite a common thing, early on in SoundCloud, when they started off, they placed a high degree of value in letting the teams pick their own programming language. And that's partly because they were wanting to make it a nice place to work for developers, so they could feel really empowered and can learn new skills. And also because at the time, they were just about growth. Just if you can justify what you're doing, do it and get a move on. And so they had, things written in Julia and Haskell and C# and Java and Scala and Clojure. And they got to a certain point where they'd grown quite quickly. They'd built this system and they're doing, for some value of good, they were doing good. And they sort of started to realize that that they were spending a lot of time and energy having to re-implement things and do the same things over and over again in different programming languages. And they said, well, look, now we're getting to the point where we've seen this, and actually we don't really think it's helping anybody. We actually think we now want to be a bit more consistent. Now, what they said is not that you have to change your programming language, but they said, look, if you're going to create a microservice, there's certain things it's going to need to do. There's certain things it's going to have to, or certain ways in which it's going to have to behave and react, so that we get consistency in terms of our architecture as a whole. Oh, and by the way, if you write your microservice in Scala or Clojure, it will just magically do that because we've written some libraries for you. But if you want to write your own thing in Haskell or S#, you can do it, but you've got to make sure it behaves the same way as the other things do. Almost overnight, everyone ditched their other programming languages, right, and moved. And so that was a change. And it wasn't to say that their original decision was wrong. It's just more that the organization had now changed. So the decision they made in the past, which is do what you want, was no longer fit for purpose today. And look, that happens all the time, right? Changing your mind that's fine. The facts change, you change your mind. The decision an architecture that was perfectly great 10 years ago may not be great now. And that's not saying the people that had your past architecture were silly or bad or wrong, just that, hey, shit happens.
Yeah. No, you're right. And actually, that's a really good example, really illustrating the point of too much autonomy, perhaps, and the consequences of that. Maybe there was a point where that was okay. I can't imagine, just from my experience, where you can allow everyone to just program everything at the same time would be a good idea. I guess if you really just want to scale without thinking about the long-term effects, perhaps. But for me, that sounds a bit out there. I'm not going to lie, but that's like, how you say, experience is king.
It is also a weird thing with some startups. It's like, startups are often like, we don't know if we're going to be around. Like if we start thinking, some startups paralyze themselves by thinking only about long-term and not enough about short-term. This is actually what I push against using microservices for most startups, because if you're a startup company, you can get trapped into this thinking you're doing a startup because you think it's a good idea. Well, if it's a good idea, loads of people will want it. Well, if loads of people are going to want it, we're going to need to scale. Right. We need to build a massively scalable system on day one. It's like, hold on. Let's find out if anyone actually thinks your product's a good idea first, because it might be that you're wrong. So actually, you should focus your time and energy initially on like, does anybody want to use this thing? And your energy, because you've only got small number of people, limited resources, your focus should be on validating your product. Once you've found your product market fit and you thought, yeah, now you can start thinking a bit longer term. So I think there's probably also that thing with SoundCloud was that they were still pivoting quite a lot, trying to find a business model. So I'd imagine that also was a degree of change that was happening almost on a constant basis internally. So I think once you get that market fit, you can then, your planning horizons often get to shift in that sort of environment. Enterprises and, you know, even more established companies think a bit differently, but yeah, sometimes for some startups I've worked with, long-term planning means working out what they can do on Friday. So it just does depends on how chaotic the environment is.
No, fair enough, fair enough. And how do you strike the balance with a company? Maybe they're on the horizon of being an enterprise, so they can have those conversations, or, you know, maybe there's a use case where they can be centralized. Essentially, they can go down the middle. Is there a fine balance between centralization and decentralization? And
Yeah.
if so, what is it?
Yeah, well, I think there are some different forces that can play out. And obviously, you've got things like, are they operating in certain regulatory environments where they have to do certain things and behave in certain ways, because that can shift things. But it also, a lot of it can come down to your kind of almost your go-to-market strategy in a way. Like, to give you another concrete example is maybe to compare, say, Azure on Microsoft and AWS from Amazon, both providing cloud services. And, you know, I'm sure there are fans on both sides, but there's an awful lot of overlap in the products that they offer, but their mindset is quite different. Amazon prioritizes speed to market, and as a result, they give a high degree of autonomy to the teams that build the product, to the point where the products don't join up and the products often contradict each other. To give you a very concrete example, I was at reInvent 2018, I want to say, and it might be 2017, and they launched, which is the big AWS kind of conference, and they launched their managed Kubernetes service, EKS, at the same time as they launched their service to run containers on a per second basis, which is something that actually Azure already had at that point with ACIs. And basically, so someone said, well, okay, so I can run my per second containers based on Kubernetes, then can I? I'm like, oh, we hadn't thought of that. It's like because they had two different product owners that just hadn't talked, and they don't talk. They don't want to, because they want to get out there. Like, their thing is, let's go. As a result, you go to the AWS console, and it is an absolute nightmare because every single thing works in a different way. You go to the Azure control panel, and there's a little bit more consistency in behavior. It's a little bit more joined up. Now, to make it more joined up and to have that degree of consistency, Microsoft have made a decision that we need to do a little bit more coordination internally. Now, as a result, that might mean they don't get to market quite as quickly with something brand new, but that's a choice they've made. But that's an example where there's almost like a product strategy or a company strategy shifts then how that plays out on the ground. Like with Amazon, it's like, go build product, ship it, make money, right? You know, you're not trying to create a lovely joined up customer experience necessarily. And you know, if you've ever tried using the AWS console, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But it works for them, right? I mean, they dominate the public cloud space. So there's something in there that, for them at least, that's the right trade-off for them.
Yeah, you're right. I guess, like I say, it depends on the context, I suppose. I think it all comes down to that. It depends. I know it's the consultant buzzword, but it really does depend on these things.
And the key thing is that balance is not static. You have to recognize, you must not have to recognize that I can push it one way or the other. I can push the seesaw up or down. And you know, people who are in technical leadership positions, and often the people I'm working with, it's often just making them aware that you're in charge of that seesaw, understand where that seesaw currently is, and then decide when you want to nudge it in a different direction. It is much more dynamic than people would like. And I think historically, people would set up one way of operating and stick like that for 20 years. And you can't do that anymore, right?
No, I hear you. That makes total sense. And just shifting the conversation slightly to still microservices, but just talking about the principles of microservices. If you had to choose one principle that really people should know about and is very essential to the principles of microservices, what would it be and why?
It's number one, it's independent deployability. So that's the idea that you can make a change to one microservice, deploy that change into production, release that change to the users of your software without having to change or deploy any other part of the system. And that should be your normal way of releasing software. So a release in a microservice architecture should be a release of a single microservice, and that's it. That's it. I mean, it's hard to do, but so many of the benefits flow from that. So many of the benefits flow from that. So it's almost like if you've done it well, there's a lot of other things you've done right as well, right? To get that right, you have to get good at like modular design and thinking about your boundaries, but it also plays into how you think about your deployment and release processes. So independent deployability is the whole thing. I did a presentation years ago called The Principles of Microservices, where I had like 8 principles. And I'm like, no. Yeah, we can talk. There are lots, but there's one. It's really one, and then the rest are all kind of ancillary in a way. But independent deployability is the one.
Awesome. And I know, for more, they can obviously see your first and second book to get a lot more information about the different principles, the advantages, and learn a lot more from that. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask you, where can people find out more about yourself? Maybe about, Sam Newman and Associates, all that sort of thing, like just talk about all of that.
Yeah, go to samnewman.io. So SAMNEWMAN.io. That's information there about the work that I do, consultancy and workshops, the private training I do. There's also links there to pretty much all the conference talks I've done over the last decade are there as well, where you can get the slides and you can click through to see actually videos of those presentations as well. Those are all freely available. There's also links there to the work I do on O'Reilly and how you can buy my books. So I've also got a book, Monolithic to Microservices, where you break monolithic systems apart into microservice architectures. Information about that is there. So all the stuff you want and probably a lot of stuff you don't want. I'm also on Twitter at Sam Newman, just to warn you that a good chunk of what I talk about tends to be sport related on occasion. So just when the cricket's on, you might want to mute me. Depends on what you've got going on. But yeah, if you want to know more about the business side of Sam, go take a look at samnewman.io, and loads of references and resources there.
Awesome. And is there anything you want to say, maybe it's about the book or just anything in general that, maybe people should know about at this point?
Okay. So I don't know, there's a couple of things I say. The first thing is that don't think of microservices as being the best solution or the default solution. They're just a thing you can do. And in many situations, there are simpler ways of solving problems. And in fact, my default position is to not use microservices unless I'm convinced otherwise. I'd say for those of you who are maybe sort of early on in your career, do whatever you can to say yes to every opportunity that comes your way. I got quite good at that early on. It took me a while, and then you have a different problem. When you've been doing this thing for like 10, 15 years, then you have to work out what to say no to. But early on, just like, even the jobs that seemed like they were a bit rubbish sometimes, but it was new, I would say yes and see what happened. And a lot of time it didn't work out, and a lot of time it did. But I think that mindset of just constantly pushing myself to try new things was really beneficial to me. And putting yourself in environments, if you're able to, that maximize your ability to discover and find new things. Often chaotic organizations are the best at that, because if no one knows what anyone else is doing, you can do whatever you want sometimes, but right, so that's always good. And yeah, I just guess they stay curious. I think as an industry, we're still really young. We often compare ourselves to, architecture or engineering, which are, depending on how you do, various disciplines that have been around for probably about 4,000 years or more. We've been around as an industry since 1950s, charitably. So the idea that we know how things should be done, we don't, but there's still great knowledge out there. So stay curious, be open to the things that have come before, but also maybe challenge the orthodoxy, and hopefully you'll kind of create things that will improve what we do as an industry going forward.
Lovely.
Hey people, so that wraps up the conversation between myself and Sam Newman. I want to take the time to thank Sam Newman on that fascinating conversation on building microservices. And if you want to learn more, do make sure you do buy his brand new book, Building Microservices, second edition. Link will be down below in the description if you want to find out more. But we also want to thank the great people at O'Reilly for giving us one of his books so we can give it away to one of you lot. So make sure you are following us at SkillStruct on all major social media platforms if you want to know more. Here is the book that we are going to be sending one of you. So do make sure you are following us at SkillStruct on social media to get the chance to win one of these books. It's only one, by the way. So unfortunately, I can only have got one. I've got Paul, but I don't have that much Paul. But anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this conversation at the very least. Do make sure you do support Sam Newman. Sam, thank you again for joining. But people, until the next time, SkillStruct out.
This is a SkillStruct presentation. If you like what you hear and see, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.